It's the right time of year to read spooky books, isn't it? Welcome to Mad on Books, where I talk about fantasy mostly, science fiction sometimes, and comics occasionally. I honestly don't really care that much about spooky season. I left America when I was 9 years old. I guess before that I was excited about Halloween. But then I moved to Australia where Halloween isn't a thing, or at least it wasn't back then. And eventually I ended up in Germany, where until very recently Halloween wasn't a thing. This year on Halloween, I had 3 rings at my doorbell. So it's become a thing, but not a huge thing. Nothing like America. But having recently restarted the channel, as I mentioned in my last video, I have been a bit undecided as to what to read. And on the 29th of October, looking at my bookshelf and feeling slightly overwhelmed and being unsure what to pick up next, I decided to pick up something I have had on my I should probably read that list since I was a teenager. Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes. This became more consciously part of my TBR thanks to a gushing review by Mike from Mike's Book Reviews, link in the description. He has read it numerous times and loved it. And that made me buy it many months ago, but it was just on my shelf. But then I thought, what the heck? I don't know what to read. It's not very thick and it's Halloween. So I read this. As usual, let's start with what's it got? Teenage boys, a sleepy American town, an impending storm, coming of age, a spooky train, a carnival, dad shit, friendship, freaks, the illustrated man, a dwarf, the maze of mirrors, lots of book love, good, and evil, disappearing neighbors, and a very sinister carousel, or merry-go-round for you Americans. Let me say to start with that I didn't really know what to expect from this book. I knew from Mike's review that it was really good, or at least he thought so, and that it had something to do with boys and coming of age, and that it was spooky. I didn't really know much more than that. It turned out to be pretty amazing. But let me tell you about the story. I'll only talk about maybe the first third of the story because a lot of what happens after that would be spoilery, and we don't want that. It happens in a sleepy small American town somewhere, I think, that isn't clearly labeled, but it's a typical 50s small American town. I'm assuming, I don't know that much about Ray Bradbury, but I'm assuming that it's basically a town of his childhood or similar. There are 2 boys who are our main characters. Will Halloway, who is pretty much good, and his friend James Nightshade, or Jim Nightshade, who even by his name is obviously not as good. But they are best friends. They're basically brothers. They live next door to each other. They do everything together. They have all of these sort of typical boy things going on. They sneak out at night, run around town, and they're not goody two-shoes good, or Will isn't goody two-shoes good, but he's basically in his soul, I guess, a good kid. And Jim, not always 100% so much. He's more mischievous, he's more troublemakery. He's the one getting Will into trouble usually. The real story starts when a train comes to town. It's a spooky, strange train, I won't get into the details, that pulls up into an empty field at 3 in the morning. On the 27th, I think, of October. And it's obviously ominous. The atmosphere is definitely built up, the tension that something is wrong about this train, that it's not a good thing that it's arrived. And the next day, or actually in the evening, the boys sneak out and they go and observe a carnival being built up out of the train in also a very strange, sinister, and spooky way. And things progress from there. There are a lot of characters in the carnival. The carnival turns out to be just as sinister and spooky as was suspected when the train arrived. And to be honest, by the end, this has turned into a pretty epic battle between good and evil. It's strange to say it's an epic battle because it's nothing like a fantasy novel. There isn't magic exactly, but there are definitely supernatural things going on. And it's not epic in the sense that anyone has a magic sword or that there's a wizard. It's the existential and also very simple and basic goodness that we experience in our lives, battling against the despair and hopelessness and sadness that we experience in our lives. It's a pretty awesome tale. So the story itself is interesting enough, but it's not necessarily the most amazing thing in the world. A lot of what makes this a really, really amazing book is the prose. How it's written is something I totally didn't expect. It is, front to cover, extremely poetic. Just labeling something poetic may put a lot of people off. So let me clarify what I mean and say something about poetry. I had a period where I read a lot of poetry and spent a lot of time with a lot of different poets. You could call a poem a heavily compressed novel, which maybe sounds like a weird idea. You've got one page with one long stanza maybe of poetry, and that's it. And that's a novel? Well, yes. The way I look at poetry and the way I experience a lot of poetry is the lines are not always very descriptive or prescriptive of what you should be thinking of or imagining. They're extremely evocative. So when you uncompress a poem, like just reading a poem quickly once and not thinking about it at all is a waste. It's probably not going to do much for you. But if you read it a few times and you start letting your mind go every time you're very consciously paying attention to the text, to the words, the individual words, to the rhythm that you're reading, I think probably most people who get into poetry start getting pictures, and that you get a lot more than just the text that's right in front of you. It could only be 5 lines. Some poems are extremely short. But if you really let your mind go with it, and if you spend some time with it and sink into it, you get a whole world of interesting story and description and things that are compressed into the text. This book is a lot like that. Like I said, it's not a very big book. It's not super thick. It, however, has so many really, really deep ideas in it that are written in very simple language, but it's very evocative, poetic language. So to me, it expanded out into so much more. It's kind of magic what Bradbury does in the book, because the simplest short paragraph or short sentences did make my mind just go in all sorts of different places and made the book much richer than just the text that was on the page. So it functioned a lot like poetry for me. I don't mean to say that it's difficult, which a lot of people think poetry is or can be, but it just had so much evocation in it for me. I jumped back to memories of when I was a kid. The 2 boys in this are 13 years old. So just on the border, so to speak, between being a child and being a man, in that sort of in-between space. They're quite intelligent. They are slowly getting more and more responsibility, but then they're also still wild as animals. And I think most boys, probably a lot of girls, had an experience like that too when at a similar age, where everything in the world seems full of potential. Everything seems maybe magical because it's new and it's different. You're still exploring things. You're developing your own rituals. You're close to your friends in a way you think you'll always be exactly that close. And it's a period of exploring and discovering new things, but also being on the cusp of losing a lot of things. Losing childhood, losing innocence, losing maybe ignorance and the feeling that anything could happen and everything's possible. The way it's written is so beautiful. Let me read you just one paragraph to get across this idea of what I mean, that it's kind of poetic. And the odd thing in Dad's voice was the sound truth makes being said. The sound of truth in a wild, roving land of city or plain country lies will spell any boy. Many nights Will drowsed this way, his senses like stopped clocks long before that half-singing voice was still. Dad's voice was a midnight school, teaching deep fathom hours, and the subject was life. A lot of the book reads that way. It's telling you something relatively straightforward while evoking a ton of other things. So it's a much bigger novel than it actually is, to me anyway. The themes, like the story, are pretty straightforward, really. And again, it's how they are handled more than what they are that really makes it feel like an experience. The obvious one is family, or specifically a father-son relationship. But I think this can be applied to any parent-child relationship. Although I do think that, especially in the old school values of this period, there was a very different, maybe not so much anymore today, since we have so many different kinds of families and gender ideas and that kind of thing. But back in the 50s, a lot of it was pretty straightforward, the standard accepted knowledge of all of that stuff anyway. A boy was very much a boy and a girl was very much a different thing. And the relationship between a father and a son and the relationship between a mother and a daughter were also, I think, very different. This is very much a father-son book. I don't mean that it won't be appealing at all to women readers. I don't know how they would experience it. For me, of course, I was a boy, and not in the 50s, but in the 70s. And this brought back so much of that feeling. It really evokes the feeling of being a boy, running wild, sneaking out, doing things you know you shouldn't do, basically just because it's adventure. And that's maybe a little bit of the difference between the two characters, Will and Jim. Will is doing it for the adventure. Jim is doing it because he likes to stir things up. He likes trouble. He likes to cause trouble. Which sort of brings us to the other big theme, which is really good and evil. And it's not good and evil in the, Lord of the Rings, Gandalf, Sauron contrast kind of a way. It's much more the really basic things that are good in our lives, like laughter and just being happy and dancing and just really, really basic things that are good, as opposed to things that break people, like sadness, like loss, like hopelessness, depression, these kinds of things. And these are the sides in the epic battle towards the end. Basic, simple goodness versus basic, simple badness. And the people who want more of the goodness and the people who maybe want more of the badness. And it's all wrapped up in this thing that makes it a good October read, a good Halloween spooky season read. There are some spooky as hell things going on in this. And it's the spookiness that comes from people who actually want the bad things. It's, just so you know, it's not gory in any way. There is no horrible like dismemberments or decapitations or blood spraying everywhere or anything like that. It's, in that sense, it's a very wholesome book. But it does have a mood. It does build a tension. The first half of the book builds a tension so bad that I was physically nervous while waiting to see what this tension was going to culminate in. If you haven't picked it up already, it's a book I really, really enjoyed. I would recommend reading it, even if it's not October. Don't wait until next year. It's worth reading. And it's one of those books that where once I read it, I immediately thought, I'm going to reread this multiple times in my life. It's a very easy read. I read it in 2 days. So it's easy to read, easy to reread, and I will definitely be coming back to this. It was really, really enjoyable, spooky, and touching and emotional. So I hope you're well. I hope you're reading awesome books like Something Wicked This Way Comes. I hope you had fun at Halloween. Did you dress up as anything? Did you read some spooky books? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you soon.